Okay, let's talk about Nevsky. One of my ways to keep warm when I don't have to actually play, wrap some blankets around myself. Figured it was also somewhat topical, so since it was handy. Alright, first off, I had a good time with it. It is covering a topic that really has not gotten, as far as I know, any study really, but there may be some say, I know that some of the late, some of the early modern operational games, in some ways aren't all that far from the period we're talking about. But the way warfare was conducted was significantly different. For operational medieval combat, you basically had two things: the sieges and trying to make the opponent pay. Not the opponent, but their subordinate lords pay enough that maybe they start defecting, or whatever, you know, and reducing their willingness to be loyal, or force them to defend their own lands rather than levy forces. You don't see that as much as the nation states start rising. You don't see the concept of the chevauchés, the raids, to decrease, to be a big impact as part of a campaign strategy. And that's kind of important. So when I say you may see some early modern games that have some similarities, I'm thinking All Is Lost Save Honor, which uses the Zucker style operational system, which works pretty well. In fact, it may actually work better in this earlier period or in the American Civil War than it does as applied to the Napoleonic combats, at least the way I play it, because it tends to create large stacks of force operating in one group. Depending on how you handle, how the particulars of the system of that design handle ideas like coordination, interception, stuff like that, you can really get the differences of the flavor though. So, I mean, the Zucker games probably allow a little bit more coordination than All Is Lost Save Honor did. I don't really remember all the specifics, but I know there was like the March to the Sound of Guns and stuff like that in the Zucker games. It wasn't absolute though, so there was still some desire to keep forces together. Well, this, you keep your forces together for the most part. We'll go into the one of the design considerations. They kind of this is a more abstract design though than those operational games were, and I think that the focus on the individual force logistics is another important part of things. When you're looking again at the early modern and definitely by the Napoleonic era, armies were able to set up their logistics in much, much more regulated and standard formats, which allowed a channeling of supplies to come through, as long as you had a reasonable pathway. And those games can handle it that way. Simply translating that over to a medieval system doesn't really make sense. First of all, there's living off the land. Now, if you go, see, here's the thing, in the early modern, you have different periods in there. So you have the 30 Years' War period where, yeah, you've got a lot of living off the land. But and where maybe there's a little bit less of that direct flow. But a little earlier in the Italian campaign, you actually had more dedicated supply routes and a more centralized command to the army. Anyway, with this, you do not have that. So you couldn't just lift sort of the Zucker supply system onto this. There was also, I think, a desire to make an appealing game to people who wouldn't necessarily be wargamers, because the wargame market has not really supported this era. You know, yeah, there's always been a fringe out there that wanted their medievals, but generally it was like, oh, ancients, and then let's jump to basically Frederick the Great. And anything in between there got very, very limited success. So by trying to capture a broader market with the wooden pieces, a somewhat more Eurofied design, definitely a more modern design system that didn't leave you with doing hex counting and stuff like that tended to flow into some of the earlier designs to figure out your supply rate capabilities and everything. Instead, this uses a more abstracted system using commands to draw your supplies to the armies, which allows the game to be accessible probably to a broader range of modern gamers. In those things, I think it did a very, very, very good job. It seems to me to be an above adequate simulation, which might seem weird because my first impression when I looked at this was, oh my God, it looks like a Euro. And I think a lot of people had that. And I was really kind of reluctant to pull the trigger on it. And honestly, if it hadn't been Volko designing the game, and even there, I kind of had a coin. If it's going to be a coin-like game in any sense, that kind of abstraction, I don't know if I need that. But also some of the people who are involved in the playtesting in it and their views on it and what they were saying, it convinced me, you know what, I can afford to pre-order this. This is one I think I can take the chance on. And it was a good move. I think this is a very exciting new design, and one that could actually, it's volume 1 of the series, one that we could see, and I hope we do, some more games on the subject, on the general subject matter of the medieval operations. In particular, I really want to see some stuff in the 100 Years' War. But this I knew less about, which may be a positive, maybe a negative. It's hard to tell. It definitely, made it harder to kind of grasp maybe what I'm supposed to be doing, but there is a good amount of information in the background, so yeah, let me start looking at the components and talking about the quality and value of each of them, and then we'll get to gameplay thoughts and such not. So the board's a nice small one. There's another panel to it. Very pretty, largely readable and understandable. It took a little bit to get used to what the different symbols mean, like these towns and forts and such not, that are smaller valued things, have their own minor, oh no, they're not towns. Yeah, these are forts, and no, I'm sorry, forts are valued things. No, these are towns. I was right to begin with. Forts are the equivalent, but with a victory symbol and somewhat larger. These are just locations. It did end up, some of the visual was a little hard to distinguish. Mainly it was hard to remember. You could see the distinguishment on the map. It's just like, oh, what does that mean? Such as. The quality of the Lord plaques, I guess, is really, really high. Obviously, the counter quality is high. GMT has really gotten into putting out thick, nice counters and nice pieces of cardboard. And they're putting them out at, a very competitive price. You have the wooden blocks, of course. What's interesting is you have a bunch of counters. These guys I actually need. But you have a bunch of counters you don't necessarily need. So you've got the choice between using chits or the wooden blocks. I found the wooden blocks preferable, largely because they're more easily identifiably visibly, and the amount of information on a counter was too much. So the visible plus the lookup on a chart was more valuable to me. Speaking of which, you have a couple of play aids. The main one is this guy, a fold out that both players get, and it has all the information on it. One little piece of errata regarding it, which I better pack in. Extra stickers, extra blocks. Again, some good stuff that GMT, when they started realizing, hey, to be good at customer service, somebody's missing a block, we'll replace it for you. We'll send you a replacement, whatever. Not because necessarily even a production issue. If somebody loses one, they might ask, hey, can I buy an extra block? No, but you can have one. So that's a really nice thing because it cuts the problem off. There's not going to... If there's a production error and there's a misformed block, which is often the case, I think I've got one in this one. If there's something missing, which is probably less likely because... they definitely have to kind of replace that, and this prevents that from happening as much. On the other side, and so they give you these are ones that you would really be missing something, so they give you extras of those. There'll probably be extras of these in there, but there's no counter limit to these, so that's not really an issue. It might be in terms of how many are possible on the board. Get a couple of player screens. Again, they're fine. It's nice to include them. Some information so that each player can look at what the other guy has in theory without having to look behind their screen, and see it. Poker quality playing cards, and these are kind of the stiffer cards, I think. I know I had trouble shuffling. You have to do a lot of shuffling in this game. Basically, each player has to shuffle their deck once per turn, and there's small decks. And small decks are hard to shuffle. The stiff cards make it hard to shuffle. I would consider sleeving these because they are this more solid quality. I've said that before on other games. All right, the background book has a nice amount of detail on a discussion of the situation. It's got information on all the cards. It's got several pages of historical background and discussions of the lords. But the majority of the book is play examples. However, what I really like is it is not set up as, here's 3 turns of the game. I know some people like that. Rather, what this is more detailed examples of the style you would find in the rulebook. And I actually, you know, I'm not going to read through the play examples, but when I need them, they serve as a reference. And this is actually one of the things, there are a couple of places. The rule book is somewhat parsimonious, actually, which is shocking. It's, you know, the print size is larger than it used to be. So at 20 pages, it's actually a fairly small rule book. There's a lot of images, a fair amount of space devoted to stuff. It's fairly procedural. It's, you do this, this, and this. But the procedural things largely made sense. Maybe it's because of where I'm coming from, but I think it's also because the design draws directly from the reality, you know? So, in a lot of cases. So if I'm looking at a lot of time spent explaining the pieces beforehand. But if I'm looking at this levy and I'm saying, okay, I have to pay my forces to keep them in the field, that kind of makes sense. Those who aren't there, they disband. It's not like some of the mechanical stuff that goes on in some of the other games that I had trouble with the procedural status of it. Things like Axis Empires, where it felt like there was a lot of things that you were doing that were kind of record-keeping kind of things, but the record-keeping didn't really make the same kind of sense that I thought it did. But it is important that you do things in precisely the order. Now, when I say procedural is a problem, you know, it's kind of funny because, in a sense, most board games are procedural. Most games are procedural. You do A, you do B, you do C. I guess what's different here is at any given time, you're almost following a directed little sequence. You don't usually have a lot of choices of things that you could do. You usually aren't looking at, you know, do I move this piece or that piece, that kind of choice. A lot of that's set and fixed into motion by the game itself. And then once you start something, you know, so if you're playing a World War II hex and counter game, you might say, well, once you start moving a piece, you could spell out procedural instructions for, as it enters a hex, it spends the amount of movement points for that hex, and then it moves to the next. The reason that you can get away with not having to state all that in the rules, there's a couple of them. One is we're familiar with it, but two is similar to the familiarity. It matches the expectations, you know. So even when things are stated out clearly and precisely in a procedural fashion, we kind of skim over it and it doesn't really mean much because we know what it's going to mean and we know why it's going to say what it does. And if it says something different, that sticks in our head as, wow, that's really weird. Why would it be that way? You know? Well, with this, while it meets the expectations perhaps, we're not very familiar with the things that are being done in the game. So that's one aspect to that. There are certain timing things like, you know, first you pay in the levy phase, then you do mustering actions, then you do the call to arms action that it almost feels like you should be able to jumble them up, but you really cannot. You will screw the game up if you do. There were a couple of places in the rules where it wasn't absolutely clear how I should interpret a particular wording. So, you know, those were the kind of situations where I had to look back into the playbook. Now I'm going to swap batteries, so we'll take a little break here. All right, hello again. Okay. So yeah, there were some points where the rules were not as clear as they perhaps could have been, but I actually favor that. It's nice to have the rule book not bloated, by a lot of special cases. And it's also kind of cool, none of the examples are in there. It's not bloated by them either. That's all in here, takes up the same paper, takes up the same cost, but it actually kind of makes it easier to read and deal with the rulebook. So there's some things I really like with the design of the rulebook, even though I had a couple of places where I said, what the fuck's going on here? The one problem with having the examples in here, and the only problem is someone lazy like me who says, I'm not sure how it is, but I'm not that bothered. I won't go look it up separate. I'll find it in the rules and interpret it as I will. And generally, however I interpreted it, which was where the language led me a little bit more towards, was indeed what was supported. So, that's what we have. As to the actual play, so the game flows around this kind of balance of how many forces you want on the map at any given time. The more forces you have on the map, the less each particular lord can do, unless they're gathered together with a marshal. If you have a marshal, or if you use lieutenants, you essentially don't have a lot of different active forces, you just have more troops assigned with it. That might seem like the wisest course of action, but the problem with it is that means that you don't have a reserve of forces to bring into the game. And that can get you into some trouble. There's a lot of ways to lose this game, and one of the ways is to end up with nobody left on the map. That's what happened to me. However, the situation was beginning to look very dire for the side that was running out of forces, even though they were winning the game on points by far. They had, the Teutons had made a major incursion into Russia, somewhat aided by cheating. I misread a rule. And, well, no, not misread. I forgot about a factor having to do with how many cards you get. So, by having to figure out this balance of how many troops do you want on the board at any given time, how much of your force do you want on the board, that becomes one of your major decisions. And also there's how much you want to muster the lords that you do have on the board. Because again, activity that you take to muster their extra forces means they're going to have larger armies. The larger armies take more supply, they move slower, and they might not be able to get as much done as a lighter force. Nice balanced choices there. Also, the subunits that they have that you muster may mean that lord becomes someone you can't get off the map anymore. You can't afford, you've put so much into him that now you have to keep funneling money into him to keep him on the board, him and his sub-troops. So, there become these different choices that are difficult to make on that. There's an interesting facet with the Arts of War cards. So, these guys serve as capabilities at the bottom, and you basically have your choice of whatever to use. It's not like a coin game where, do I want this capability or not, where you draw it and see. It's actually more of a, you have all the capabilities available. The one weird question with that choice is some of the capabilities come and they prevent certain events from happening if you don't have that if you have that capability applied. I have some questions as to some of the choices on there. Some of them may make sense, but others it feels like you have some gamey capability to prevent events from happening in a way that whenever there's something like that, I want to know why. And I think the answer why here is game balance, which never pleases me much. And it's kind of weird because in this game, there's a lot of randomness. There's a lot of capability of really extreme things just happening that can screw you over. This is not a game for the person who insists that if they plan, their plan goes according to plan. It is not a game that necessarily goes to the person who plays the better game. There's enough luck in it that a poorer play can get you an advantage. I have no problem with that. Some people will. Speaking of planning, there is a lot of planning you have to do up front on each turn. So the turns are divided up where you do a levy and then a campaign. And at the beginning of the campaign, you select a certain number of your lords who are going to be activated and are going to get to do their particular capability for action on each card draw that you're going to get. In the summer, you get 6 cards. In the winter, it's down to 4. Now, during the levy phase, you have to kind of know what you're going to do, because that's the time when you prepare your transport. That's the point, and pretty much the only point, where you're able to add to your transport capability. Your transport capability is absolutely vital to determining how much supply you can carry into battle, or into whatever you're doing. And it also affects how quickly you can resupply, the range at which you could resupply, all kind of stuff like that, in terms of how far, how fast you're going to be able to go. So basically, you have a little bit of a mathematical problem at the beginning of each 40-day turn, where you have to know up front what you're going to do and then figure out how to do it. It might not work the way you think it's going to, but you can pretty much pre-plan it all. The things that are going to interfere is opponent activity, and trying to think of event cards come in. Event cards have already been played, so you'll know what the events are. I found this very challenging at first. But once I did it a couple of times, I started to get more used to it. So again, in a lot of ways, this is a new system, so I would suggest playing around with it a little bit before you play whatever a serious game is. So to me, my solitaire game that I played on video, I consider my serious game, even with all the screw-ups and everything. I had fiddled with the game a little bit beforehand. I had played the introductory scenario. So the actual movement is largely determined by your supply and your transport capabilities. And those are what are going to limit you the most. Although also, each leader has his own command rating, which indicates when you draw his card, how much stuff he can do. Which means certain leaders are better commanding forces than others. And you can make them your lieutenants, or your marshals are always pretty good leaders. You do not want to travel without supplies, which generally means that you will be traveling along the type of routes that your transport supports, either water or road. Kind of neat thing in the winter is water and road become the same, and all you need is sleds. And in a sense, you have easier transport, because usually there's not a good path. I don't know. It depends on where you are, but in a lot of cases, the best paths require you to have water and cart transport capabilities. So if I want to, I don't know. I'm looking here. There's a water path. The road paths are going to be longer and more painful. If I want to get to Novgorod from Pskov, there's no water-only path, but there's also no dirt-only path this way, nor this way. No matter what, I've got to use water transport. And that makes it very difficult to get there. Because it's unlikely that you're going to have... Well, it's hard to build up good movement speed over all land transport. Now there's ways to get around that. One of them is building castles for the Teutonics to get them close. And that can be a dangerous thing because that can actually give victory points to the Russians when they recapture them. Of course, you're getting victory points for building them, but the battle rules are kind of like a battle board type situation. Individual lords face off against each other, a la Kingmaker or whatever, and you roll their attacks. Well, a la the advanced rolls. You roll their attacks specifically. The randomness in combat is present, but it's only present in terms of saving throws, essentially. But as long as there's randomness, I don't see a problem. You know, to me, games that have deterministic combat systems, and for that matter, deterministic movement, feel like they're failing as simulations to some extent. The movement is largely deterministic. The combat is not because of the saving throws. You might do nothing. You know, it is possible that you will not do any damage at all on any given attack, which creates very, very, wide variance in terms of impact during combats, especially when there's a lot of pieces involved, which I like. And it seems to, it matches some of the results that you get in medieval combat. If you look historically, some of the times, things that don't necessarily seem like... There's always reasons, but at a game at this level, a lot of those reasons are abstracted. In the case of sieges, you are limited to the number of rounds of combat you have, and the defender, both sides actually, have additional defenses so they take less losses. And you really kind of have to wipe them out to win the siege. There's also a way of just sort of starving a place out. Victory in the game is through a combination, like I said, there's many ways to lose the game. One of the easiest is losing all your lords, or being in a position where you can't muster lords because you've used up too many of your lords and now they're all off the map and you don't have enough and the enemy can chase your guy down or whatever, just due to the timing of the campaign calendar. But outside of that, if you reach the end of the scenario, victory is done in points based on what things you've captured and what things you've raided. For the most part. The Russians can generate victory points by telling their prince that they don't really need him. Or his son, brother. Yeah, I think so. No, son. I don't remember. Okay. There are a couple of things in play that irked me. The one biggest one that I ran into was, and I'm not being able to think very well right now. The biggest. Let me close the door. Maybe I can think better when I'm not being listened to. The biggest one was a marshal or a lieutenant can move forward the entire amount of actions that they could move in the course of a 40-day turn. The entire amount of actions that a smaller force could move in that 40-day turn. And then somebody who's under them can go out and do other stuff. And initially, to me, it seems like it's almost a time warp type thing. I've gotten into a discussion mainly with the playtesters, but also Volko stepped in and gave gave what was really the most valuable input into it, which was the reason why it works that way was not just hey, marshals give you more command capability or whatever, but because he wanted the idea of a force moving forward and spreading out. Now, stated that way didn't make sense to me, but what I was able to refine that statement to that big force could be moving with with other forces extended in front of it that would actually reach the enemy earlier, so that there is no time problem there. And I can do some similar hand-wavy type things, like if you know that you've got a larger force coming at a siege, you can prepare the assault better. You can maybe devote more of your men to digging because it's going to be more important. Stuff like that. That means, although I came up with something that on a strict, hey, if I was looking at timelines, this is what I'd be worried about. A modification where each leader could only be activated on 3 commands. You only have 3 command cards in the deck. So if the marshal activated you, you would only be able, like if he activated you 3 times, you would not be able to take additional commands. You would have been serving with the marshal directly during the entire thing. But there's a little bit of fuzz there because it is kind of an abstracted design. It's not clear that those forces are actually with the marshal all the time, that they're not extending out, that the marshal's supply isn't carrying their supply for them while they're working out. The problem with it for me was I saw a couple of cases where it looked like there was really ugly exploits, things that just could not have been done other than by taking advantage of this. And also, somewhat worse, was when a lieutenant was in command and they got disbanded somehow. They gave this impetus of additional actions to the other leader. Now, that's not a situation you would normally put yourself in, because a lieutenant is presumed to be commanding the force he's on top of, so you wouldn't select any command cards for the force he's on top of. But if those are the only 2 lords on the map, then it makes sense to put them both in your deck, just with the thought of, well, if the lieutenant's gone, I'll do that. I'll get to use those. So there were potentials for some results that did not seem acceptable to me. There was something else I didn't like. Another artifact, but I can't remember it. I don't even know if I mentioned it in the playthrough. But yeah, so I'm just gonna skip over it. But overall, in terms of play and fun, even though this required that kind of pre-planning, it wasn't so heavy once you got used to doing it a couple of times that, even somebody like me who hates doing pre-planning was really bothered by it. You don't have a lot of pieces on the board, so the problem is tractable. You can hold it in your head at once and figure out what you're going to do. You might fuck it up, but you can figure out what you're going to do. The actual play tells a story in a way that something this abstracted looking wouldn't immediately jump to mind as being able to tell. So for example, with the coin games, I have trouble sometimes grabbing the narrative in them. In this, I have none. It seems, sometimes I have, wow, I got to make something interesting up because I just got 6 moves in this 40-day period when I should have only gotten 3. But sometimes I am really having trouble finding words today. I took an aspirin, it might be affecting me. The yeah, I'm getting myself lost. I don't even know what I was saying. I'm talking about the narrative, but I don't know what I'm saying about it. You're looking at, you know, what one lord is doing, moving along a path, trying to get to a certain place. You've got a specific goal in mind when you build your command deck, when you do your levy, and you watch it unfold. The battles that happen are discrete events. Coin has a much more abstracted situation. So I would say the coin situation feels more like, well, let's say I'm playing Britannia, right? You know, but there's a lot more detail going on to get the proper level of simulation. It's just that detail doesn't link to direct images of what is actually happening. So I'm doing more mechanical things in those games than what translates into actual actions that I can picture. And I got the same problem with Axis Empires, by the way. Here, that's not the case. Everything that I kind of am doing feels like something the commander would be doing. You know? Levying my resources for the campaign? Yeah, that feels like it. Planning what I'm going to do? Yeah, that feels like something that I'm going to do. And then it unfolds as it happens. It's not, you know, this, oh, look, there's a card. Oh, let's take this opportunity, you know. It feels very much, very tightly coupled with the reality that's there. And that's very important to me. Like I said, though, there have been a couple of places where I felt like, this feels a little off. This felt a little too gamey with the time issue. And then the planning does take a little burden on me. Overall, though, I have to say this has been really a pleasant game. And a really has me excited about possible follow-ups with it. I don't know. I'm very happy to have this and to have been able to play it. I'm not so happy about where my mind is today, because obviously I'm making even less sense than usual. But there you have it. I'm sure some people will disagree and say, I usually manage to make this little sense. Alright, so definitely if you're interested in even just seeing, I mean, this triggered thoughts for me towards my game design that's been kicking around for many decades and will never get done. But it, gave me some ideas towards that, having seen what was managed here. That, you know, if you're at all interested in seeing anything at an operational medieval level, I would say that this is definitely something you want to pick up. Even if it doesn't end up becoming, you know, a go-to play, which I could definitely see it would. It's got a nice pace to it. It doesn't have a huge footprint. And it's not tiny, but there are scenarios that are pretty small that you can definitely do in a couple hours. So, you know, and they don't look uninteresting. Like, I had fun with that first one. I'm sure some of the others are also pretty good. The campaign is probably where you want to be playing, though, I would say. It's just, I don't know. That's just me. But yeah, if you have any thoughts of, like, you know, hey, how come there are no strategic operational type medieval stuff? This might give you some hints into at least some of what you would have to incorporate to get the level of detail that you'd want in that, to match something like a War and Peace or a Third Reich or some or WIF or whatever, where you're covering things in a little bit more detail than the broad areas and 1 year turn cards of empires and empires of the Middle Ages and stuff like that. So yeah, I think this is a lot of fun, and I apologize greatly for my babbling because I know I'm not making a lot of sense.